President Obama makes one more change to U.S.-Cuba policy a week before leaving the White House by eliminating the wet foot, dry foot policy. Joining us to discuss the implications of this is Cuban law expert Pedro Freyre, chair of the international practice group of law firm Akerman LLP. Welcome, Pedro. Thanks so much for being with us.
And it's a pleasure to be here.
So first off, can you explain for our viewers exactly how the wet foot, dry foot policy works as applied to Cuban immigrants?
Yes. The wet foot, dry foot policy is basically a policy directive that is in the purview of the executive branch. And what it basically did is, if you are a Cuban immigrant and you arrived at the U.S. and you actually set foot on dry land in U.S. territory, absent an overwhelming reason not to accept you, like you're a criminal and so forth, you would be immediately paroled out and you would be on a path to citizenship under a law called the Cuban Adjustment Act. In a year and a day, that Cuban immigrant could apply for permanent residency in the U.S. and thereafter to become a citizen. If you were, on the other hand, stopped in the high seas somewhere in the Florida Straits, you would be sent back immediately to Cuba. And that's the rationale for wet foot, dry foot.
Now, is there any other country in the world to whom the U.S. extends this offer to its citizens?
No. This is the Willy Wonka gold ticket for Cubans coming over to the United States.
And it is a policy that's been in place since the 90s, but grew out of the 1966 Cuban Adjustment Act, correct? Which allowed the U.S. to treat Cubans fleeing the Castro regime more favorably than other immigrants. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. And the rationale for the Cuban Adjustment Act way back in the 60s was that Cubans were being obligated to leave their country fundamentally for political reasons. As time has gone by and the reality in Cuba has evolved, the majority of people leaving Cuba today illegally do so for economic reasons, not really for political reasons. So the underlying rationale for the Cuban Adjustment Act is basically obsolete at this point.
Which is, I'm assuming, why President Obama has now gotten rid of it. But this policy has always been a thorn in the side of the Cuban government. Were government leaders there pressuring President Obama to get this done before leaving office?
Yes, they were. I think the rationale on the Cuban side is that it basically incentivized the people to leave the island and to do so in an illegal fashion, which basically risked their lives and put burdens on other countries and so forth. The brain drain was really very real for the Cuban side. So on the other hand, it also created an escape valve, if you will, from Cuban economic harsh realities, and people who were disaffected with the government had a way out. So the Cubans felt that it was just unfair.
Right. And so now that President Obama has done this, did the Cuban government promise any sorts of reforms or anything in exchange? Do we know?
Not necessarily, no. But the Cuban government did agree to take back 2,746 Cuban immigrants that arrive here illegally and that are subject to being deported. So these are folks that I would imagine a Trump administration is going to be very eager to send back to Cuba right away.
Right. Now, how is this move then likely to be viewed by the Cuban hardliners here in the U.S., such as Senator Marco Rubio?
Marco Rubio already came out on the record, and it was interesting because his opening statement was, I've been advocating for a reform of the Cuban Adjustment Act for a long time now. So I think kind of it was, they stole his thunder. But on the other hand, he said that it, once again plays into the hands of the Cuban government, and it shuts down an ability for Cuban Americans to flee Cuba and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is that it's going to be awfully difficult for anybody to really articulate a good rationale to reverse this policy. The other thing that was criticized by Senator Rubio was the fact that part and parcel of the agreement was a shutdown of a special parole program for Cuban doctors who wanted to defect to the U.S. That avenue is now shut down, and any Cuban doctors that want to defect can do so using normal means available for political refugee and asylum requests in any U.S. consulate anywhere in the world.
Right, so they won't be getting any special favors now. So what do you think are likely to be the consequences of eliminating this policy, both intended and perhaps unintended?
I think the first consequence, quite frankly, is you're gonna see a much slower flow of people trying to leave Cuba and get to the U.S. illegally. So there should be a channeling to legal means, and the U.S. committed to giving at least 20,000 legal visas for Cuban immigrants leaving Cuba. The second thing I think is going to happen, and I think this is a good effect, is that it's going to increase internal pressure in Cuba for reform. The folks who are leaving Cuba are the ones that are most disaffected and negatively impacted by Cuban political shortcomings and economic shortcomings. So I think those folks, those people are now going to put more pressure internally in the Cuban system to have reforms going forward.
All right. And so as of today, as of Thursday, all Cuban immigrants are being treated the same way as immigrants from any other country. Is that correct, Pedro?
That is absolutely right. It was as of yesterday evening, and unfortunately, some folks are caught in the pipeline in Central America. They're now in limbo because they're not subject to being sent back. They're not in the U.S. yet, and they are in these third countries, and they need to. Those countries need to now work out arrangements with the Cuban government.
All right, Pedro Freyre, thank you so much for all of your insight.
Thank you, Tanya.